Hey everyone, David here, back again to review another episode of The Walking Dead, and this time it is for the episode entitled Them. And if it's The Walking Dead, and you got an exhilarating, very fast-paced episode one week, chances are you're going to get a much more slow-paced, much more character-driven episode the next. And that's what I believe we got with Them. And the perfect way to summarize how I feel about this episode is that this is what I like to call a bullet point episode. And this doesn't just apply to The Walking Dead, but this applies to almost any show that manages to find an episode within its season that fits this criteria. And that is that the reason why I call it a bullet point episode is because this is the kind of episode where characters just go from point A to point B, doing things that the show usually does with them. And with the case with The Walking Dead, it's our characters mourning certain losses, dealing with what it takes to survive, that kind of thing, stuff that we've tackled before. And then in between we have things that are actually significant enough to actually talk about within a review. So this might be a little bit of a shorter review this time around. I usually go into much deeper detail, and therefore that makes for like 10, sometimes even 15-minute episode reviews. But because this episode had very little in it to really, I'm not going to say keep me invested, because I was invested from beginning to end, because I was trying to absorb as much as I possibly could from those character moments. Nothing of great importance or significance happens for quite some time in between. So I'm just going to tackle those main points. But to keep things a little bit more broad for the meantime, I'll say that there were some character moments that I really did appreciate. Certain nuances that I'm like, okay, that's kind of cool. We have certain characters that are grieving losses from the previous two episodes, mainly Daryl, Maggie, and Sasha. And Daryl and Maggie are obviously both dealing with the loss of Beth, considering that just happened like, what, 2 days ago? 2-3 days? I mean, sure, it's been a couple of months for us because we had to wait for that mid-season break to be over, but for these characters and within the story, it's only been a handful of days. It's only been like 2, maybe 3 days. So obviously they're still dealing with this back-to-back death count. And Daryl and Maggie are both dealing with the loss of Beth, and of course Daryl, because he was the one with Beth the most back after the prison went AWOL, he's also feeling it. But of course Maggie is her sister, and again, going back to how I feel about the death of Beth, about how I didn't really care so much about the character, but I did care about the reaction that other characters had to her death, mainly Maggie, who just found out that she was alive, only to have her be killed within the same exact day. That's just harsh, and Maggie kind of reflects on that in this episode. However, she remains functional. She remains strong, despite having her moments of temptation to give up. Moments of temptation that even Father Gabriel was having when he threw away his thing. I don't know what that's called, but the thing that fathers have on their neck. And of course he kind of bounces back when the rain falls later on, and he's kind of like, oh, I'm sorry, Lord, so he kind of bounces back. He bounces back almost similar in a way that Maggie does by the end of the episode, so I really appreciated that. And going back to Daryl, he has this moment where he has his, what I like to call his Saving Private Ryan moment, where he remains, very stone-faced in front of the rest of the group, but then he goes off to the woods saying that he's going to look for water, but he just suddenly breaks down, mourning the loss of Beth. And I love character moments like that, especially for characters who kind of put up a front for other people like Daryl. And then, I don't have a picture of her, but Sasha, who's mourning the loss of Tyrese from last week's episode. This is where I think that the whole mourning process of some of these characters kind of hit a snag, because Sasha's going through the same exact thing that Tyrese was going through. And it's kind of frustrating, because for one, she keeps saying how different they are, yet she's going through the same exact shit, which is kind of understandable considering that they're brother and sister. But it's also kind of frustrating for me as an audience member to really feel sorry for a character when, unlike Maggie, she's not that functional. In fact, for a moment there in the midway point when they're at the bridge and they're trying to save their energy from killing these walkers by simply just pushing them off the bridge, and then all of a sudden Sasha goes in for the kill. It is during this scene where I'm like, okay, I understand that you're grieving the loss of your brother, but please do not be a hazard to the rest of the team, because she was legitimately putting them in danger. And Michonne says, hey, stop, and she wouldn't stop. And I was honestly expecting Michonne to at least give her a look, which in a way she kind of did, give her a look like, hey, if you keep doing this, you're out. And by out, we don't just mean maybe out of our operations, but maybe even out of the group. I mean, Carol got in some ways excommunicated by Rick when he found out that Carol was the one who put those two people down in the prison. So if Sasha could be just as much of a hazard, just as much as a danger to the rest of the group, even if she's doing it unintentionally, but much more psychologically, then they're going to take that drastic measure to just ban her, because it's like, hey, we can't have you here doing this. You either need to get over it and really suck it up, or you're out of here. And I think just like Maggie, she also manages, and with each other, which I think is kind of poetic, they find a way to really move on. You know, not just physically because they have to move on down the road, but also metaphorically move on from their grievances and hopefully find a way to adapt to this world. Again, little things happen here and there throughout the episode. Carl gives Maggie the box that then Daryl later on fixes, and that kind of manages to find a smile within Maggie. You also got Eugene kind of putting himself at risk because he kind of knows that he's the one partially responsible for some of the shit that went down because of his lie. But then we have Abraham knocking the water out of his hand in a way, kind of saying like, hey, even though you were a lying son of a bitch, I still have I found in you something that kept me from wanting to kill myself back in that flashback. So hey, the least I can do is to try to keep you alive, even though you were lying about Washington. I'm still gonna find a way to keep you alive. I'm just not gonna be nice about it. And then we had that moment in the barn with Rick telling his story about his grandfather, which was really meaningful, leading to what I thought was one of the coolest moments in the show, where he finally says, "We are the Walking Dead," which I believe is from the comics. Correct me if I'm wrong. Please put in the comments, because I feel a little lazy to look it up. But I'm pretty sure in the comics, Rick does have his monologue where he finally says, "We are the Walking Dead." The Walking Dead aren't necessarily the walkers out there, the zombies, but we are essentially the Walking Dead. And I love that. It was something to make me as an audience member look back at how far they have gone from the beginning of the show. And speaking of that barn scene, that scene where the walkers are outside with the lightning flashing, that not only was that a really cool shot, but seeing all of them kind of band together to push that door and keep it there, that was actually a pretty good scene. Sure, I kind of wish I could have seen how that played out, because they do that kind of cop-out thing where they cut to black and then the next scene everything's okay. Kind of wish I would have seen how that got resolved, but we kind of get an image of that later on, where we see all those tree branches being knocked all over the place, destroying all those walkers. And the last bullet point, if you will, would be the thing that everybody is probably going to be talking about after watching this episode, because I believe this is directly lifted from the comics, and that is the character of Aaron making an appearance at the end of the episode. And he was actually the one responsible for leaving that little batch of water bottles right there in the middle of the road, saying "from a friend." And when I first saw that, I was thinking, Morgan. Please let it be Morgan. It's been a while since we've seen Morgan. He needs to come back, and hopefully he comes back in some big way by the end of the season, because I'm going to get a little irritated if he doesn't. But it gets revealed that it was actually this guy, Aaron, and he actually wants to talk to Rick and the leader of the group, and he's got something up his sleeve. And of course, Sasha and Maggie, who are pointing guns at him, are very untrustworthy based on past experiences, and for very good reason. Now, I have not caught up on the comics. In fact, I barely read the comics these days. I dabble here and there, but I don't know that much about Aaron or who he's working for, because chances are he's got a place. He's got a community, because there's no way that somebody can be this clean. I mean, as soon as he walked in, looking like he just came from a small 2-mile hike, I'm like, okay, what's your deal? So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out next week. And I'm very dubious to see who it is that he's working for, or who sent him to look for Rick, because he knows who Rick is. How the hell does he know who Rick is? So this is arguably the most interesting thing that happened in this week's episode so far. So besides our characters looking for food and water during the first half of this episode, which, to be honest, is also another thing that I really liked about it, which is that it actually made me feel very icky and sweaty and dirty and most of all thirsty and hungry, because there was just so many shots where everybody was just looking so tired and so sweaty, and they kept emphasizing the sun in those shots that, oh man. And it makes matters worse that here in California we're actually already warming up, and it's still February. It's still winter, and yet we're already getting some 60, 70 degree weather outside. And if you guys know me, you know that I prefer the cold over the heat. I love the cold. Well, I don't really love it. There's moments where I'm like, kind of bites, but I prefer it over the heat, which is why I love the holidays so much. But it's barely February and it's already hot, and this episode just reminded me even more of it, especially during that first half. But besides looking for food and water, our characters also found something within themselves metaphorically, especially the ones that are mourning the loss of previous characters that they loved, as well as of other characters who are trying to strive for what it means to survive in this world. Still. Besides that, we also got some interesting things, some good character moments, plus that big comic book reveal at the end of this week's episode. So for that, I give them a low 8 out of 10. Definitely a small step back from last week's episode, but I still think that it's one worth talking about, and one that, because of that big comic book character reveal at the end, will propel a better momentum for next week's episode. But for now, let me know what you guys thought of this week's episode in the comments below. Who do you think Aaron works for? What do you think he wants? If you haven't read the comics, please do not post anything if you have read the comics, because I'm not caught up. I'd rather keep things fresh, and then later on, after I have processed what happens to the show, then I'll caught up with the comics and see how they compare. But for now, let me know what you guys think of this week's episode, and I'll see you guys next time.